In a small Alabama town, a dark secret lay hidden within a seemingly ordinary family. A devoted wife uncovers a chilling affair between her husband and his half-sister, igniting a chain of events that leads to betrayal, murder, and a trial that stuns the community. This is the haunting story of love, lies, and the devastating consequences of forbidden desires. It was 2006, a quiet summer in rural Alabama. The Wallace family home sat at the end of a dirt road lined with towering oak trees. The house was modest but warm, with pale blue shutters and a wraparound porch where Susan often sat in the evenings, sipping iced tea while their children played in the yard. From the outside, everything about the Wallace family seemed picture-perfect. Susan Wallace, 30, was the heart of the household. A devoted homemaker, she found joy in small, everyday things, baking pies for the church fundraiser, sewing her children's clothes, and keeping the house spotless. She had a nurturing nature, always putting others before herself. Growing up in a strict but loving household, she learned the value of commitment and hard work from her parents. Her marriage to Mark was her pride, and she believed they had built a strong, unshakable foundation. Mark Wallace, 35, was the breadwinner of the family. A skilled mechanic, he worked long hours at the local repair shop. He was quiet, dependable, and seemed to share the same family values as Susan. To the outside world, Mark was a man devoted to his family. But Mark's past was more complicated than anyone, including Susan, truly understood. Mark had grown up in the shadow of his father's infidelity. His father, a man with a wandering eye, had a brief affair that resulted in the birth of a child, Lyla Carter. Lyla's existence was whispered about in the small Alabama town, but it was largely ignored by Mark's family. Mark's mother, a proud and stoic woman, refused to acknowledge the affair or the child it produced. Lyla and her mother moved to another town, and for years, Mark had no contact with her. Everything changed when Mark turned 17. Lyla's mother brought her to Mark's town, and the two half-siblings met for the first time. Lyla, just 15 then, was bold and rebellious, the polar opposite of Mark's quiet, disciplined demeanor. The connection they formed was immediate, but far from ordinary. Lyla was drawn to Mark's steadiness, and Mark, who had grown up yearning for a deeper bond in his fractured family, found himself captivated by her wild energy. What began as an innocent sibling bond took a darker turn as they grew older. By the time Mark was 19, their relationship had crossed boundaries that should have remained untouched. It was a secret they both carried into adulthood, unspoken, but never forgotten. When Mark married Susan at 27, he believed that chapter of his life was behind him. It was in the 2010 when Mark's carefully constructed life began to unravel. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Mark received an unexpected letter from Lyla. She had found his address through mutual family connections. The letter was vague but emotional, full of longing and regret. Lyla claimed she wanted closure, to finally speak about their past and move on. Mark was hesitant, but couldn't ignore the pull of unfinished business. When they met at a diner on the outskirts of town, Lyla was no longer the wild teenager he remembered. Now 33, she was striking, confident, and had an air of control that was both intimidating and alluring. She spoke about her struggles, failed relationships, a career that hadn't taken off, and a lingering sense of displacement from being the product of an affair. What began as an innocent meeting quickly shifted. As they reminisced about their shared past, Lyla leaned into the unresolved tension between them. Mark, despite his better judgment, found himself unable to resist. The affair was rekindled that day, a choice that would ripple through their lives with devastating consequences. For the next few months, Mark and Lyla carried on their affair in secret. They met at motels outside town, careful not to leave any traces. Their relationship was intense, fueled by years of suppressed emotions and the thrill of the forbidden. But it was also tumultuous. Lyla's manipulative tendencies began to surface. She demanded Mark's attention and grew jealous of the life he shared with Susan. Mark, on the other hand, was plagued by guilt. He loved Susan and their children deeply, but he couldn't sever the toxic bond he shared with Lyla. Each time he promised himself it would be the last, Lyla would pull him back in, playing on his weaknesses and their shared history. By early 2011, Susan began noticing changes in Mark. He started coming home late, citing extra shifts at work. He was distant, often lost in thought, and their once lively conversations became short and strained. On some nights he would avoid her touch altogether, retreating to the garage after dinner. Susan's breaking point came on a rainy afternoon in March 2011. While doing laundry, she found a crumpled receipt in Mark's jeans pocket. It was from a motel in a neighboring town, dated just a week prior. At first she tried to dismiss it. Perhaps he had been there for work or to help a friend. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, Susan began to piece things together. She noticed the way Mark's phone buzzed at odd hours and how he would step outside to take calls. One evening, while Mark was in the shower, Susan couldn't resist the urge to check his phone. What she found shattered her world. A string of messages from a woman named Lyla, some flirtatious, others explicitly detailing their meetings. On the night of March 20th, 2011, Susan confronted Mark. She waited until the children were asleep, then calmly placed his phone on the kitchen table, open to the messages. Mark initially denied everything, insisting Lyla was just an old family friend. But when Susan pressed him, her voice shaking with both anger and heartbreak, Mark's facade crumbled. He confessed to the affair but left out the most shocking detail. It wasn't until Susan demanded to know how he knew Lyla that Mark revealed the truth. Lyla wasn't just his lover, she was his half-sister. Susan's reaction was one of disbelief and revulsion. She felt as though her entire marriage had been a lie. The man she thought she knew, hiding something so dark and incomprehensible. Susan didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at photos of their family, trying to make sense of how Mark could betray her in such a way. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would expose the affair, no matter the cost, believing that the truth needed to come out for her own peace and the safety of her family. What Susan couldn't foresee was the devastating chain of events her decision would set in motion. What would happen next? The answer was more horrifying than anyone could imagine. The Wallace family's collapse began on a Sunday evening in June 2011. In the living room of Mark and Susan's modest Alabama home, Susan had spent weeks grappling with the weight of Mark's betrayal. She oscillated between rage and despair, unsure whether to keep the affair a secret for the sake of their children or to expose the truth. Ultimately, her anger won out, fueled by Lyla's increasing boldness. Lyla had started leaving cryptic voicemails, almost taunting Susan, claiming she and Mark shared a bond that no one could break. Susan decided the truth couldn't remain buried. She called for a family meeting, inviting both her parents and Mark's, as well as Lyla herself. The meeting took place on a humid evening in the Wallace home, the air thick with tension even before anyone said a word. The children had been sent to Susan's sister's house for the night, unaware of the storm brewing within their family. As the family gathered, Susan laid everything bare. She spoke in a calm but deliberate tone, recounting the months of betrayal she had uncovered and the horrifying truth about Lyla and Mark's relationship. Mark sat in silence, his face pale, while Lyla smirked defiantly, as if proud of the chaos she had sown. The revelation hit their parents like a tidal wave. Mark's mother, a proud woman who had spent decades ignoring the existence of Lyla, broke down in tears. She was devastated, not only by Mark's betrayal of Susan, but by the realization that her husband's infidelity had led to such a monstrous situation. Mark's father sat rigid, staring at the floor, his guilt for the family's fractured past written all over his face. Lyla's mother, on the other hand, lashed out in anger. She blamed Mark for corrupting her daughter, refusing to acknowledge that Lyla had willingly rekindled the affair. The room descended into chaos, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Lyla, however, remained eerily calm. She claimed she and Mark were soulmates, and that their relationship transcended morality or family ties. Her audacity left everyone stunned. In the days that followed, Mark made desperate attempts to salvage his marriage. He begged Susan for forgiveness, promising that he would cut ties with Lyla forever. He even went so far as to block Lyla's number and swear he would never see her again. But Susan's trust was shattered beyond repair. She couldn't erase the image of Mark and Lyla together or forget the betrayal of her vows. Susan turned to her family for support, spending long hours on the phone with her sister and parents. She began discussing separation, though the thought of breaking apart her family weighed heavily on her heart. The emotional turmoil consumed her. Nights were sleepless, her mind racing with thoughts of what had gone wrong, while days were filled with the exhausting task of pretending everything was fine for the sake of her children. Lyla, meanwhile, refused to let Mark go. She became obsessed, convinced that Susan was the only thing standing in the way of her happiness. She began harassing Susan with calls, leaving messages laced with venom and threats. Sometimes the calls were pleading, begging Susan to step aside. Other times, they were menacing, with Lyla accusing Susan of being unworthy of Mark. The harassment didn't stop there. Lyla started showing up uninvited, lingering outside the Wallace home. Neighbors noticed her car parked on the street at odd hours. Once, Susan spotted Lyla standing at the edge of their driveway, staring at the house with an unsettling intensity. Despite Mark's attempts to cut her off, Lyla found ways to insert herself into their lives, refusing to accept that he had chosen his family over her. By early 2012, Susan's fear began to grow. She started keeping the doors locked at all times and even considered filing a restraining order. But in the quiet moments, she questioned whether she was overreacting. After all, Lyla hadn't physically harmed anyone yet. Still, the tension in the Wallace household was palpable. Mark was constantly on edge, torn between guilt and the fear of what Lyla might do next, while Susan tried to hold herself together for the sake of her children. The morning of the March 6th, 2012, started like any other. Susan, now living in quiet defiance of the chaos swirling around her, had planned a day of errands and household chores. The children were at school, and the house was unusually still. But by midday, everything would change. At 10:42 a.m., a neighbor, Mrs. Albright, noticed something unusual. The front door of the Wallace home was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Mrs. Albright, a retired teacher, thought it was odd, but didn't immediately investigate. It wasn't until 12:15 p.m., when Susan failed to pick up her youngest child from school, that alarms were raised. By 1:30 p.m., the police arrived at the Wallace home. The scene they discovered was horrifying. Susan's body was found in the living room, lying in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slit, and there were signs of a struggle. Furniture overturned. Broken glass scattered across the floor. The crime scene pointed to a crime of passion. The violence, so personal, it left no doubt that the killer had acted out of intense emotion. The police noted that the house had been ransacked, but nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. This wasn't a burglary. It was a targeted attack. Susan's phone, still on the kitchen counter, had several missed calls from an unknown number. By March 8, 2012, the police had begun piecing together the events leading up to the murder. Mark was questioned extensively. He provided an alibi, claiming he had been at work that morning, which was corroborated by his colleagues. However, his connection to Lyla made him a person of interest. Attention quickly shifted to Lyla. Neighbors reported seeing her car near the Wallace home in the days leading up to the murder, and several mentioned her erratic behavior in recent months. The police obtained a warrant to search her apartment, where they found troubling evidence, a notebook filled with obsessive writings about Mark, Susan, and their family. On March 12, 2012, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Lyla disappeared. Her apartment was left untouched, as if she had fled in a hurry. Her car was found abandoned near the Alabama-Georgia state line later that evening, sparking fears that she was attempting to escape. The Wallace family's tragedy had shaken the small Alabama town to its core. Susan's death, so sudden and violent, left her children orphaned in every sense. Mark, though alive, was a shell of his former self, consumed by guilt and the weight of his choices. And Lyla, the woman who had once been part of their family, was now the prime suspect in a murder that would haunt them all forever. What would happen next was uncertain. But one thing was clear. The fallout from Mark and Lyla's forbidden relationship had reached its horrifying conclusion. For 4 months, Lyla Carter evaded law enforcement, slipping through their grasp like a shadow. Her disappearance on the March 12, 2012, had sparked a nationwide manhunt, with her name and face plastered across every news outlet. Investigators uncovered evidence that she had been living off cash, using fake IDs, and moving frequently between small towns, always staying one step ahead of authorities. The break in the case came on the July 20th, 2012, when a Border Patrol agent at the Canadian border noticed a woman nervously waiting to cross. Her appearance was drastically altered. Her once vibrant auburn hair was now dyed a dull brown, and she had shed significant weight. But it was her eyes, haunted and restless, that gave her away. When her fake identification didn't pass scrutiny, Lyla attempted to flee, bolting across the checkpoint. She didn't make it far. After a brief chase, she was tackled to the ground and subdued. In her bag, officers found a large sum of cash, a forged passport, and a journal filled with disturbing entries about Mark and Susan. Many of the entries described a fantasy of being reunited with Mark after Susan's removal. Lyla was immediately extradited to Alabama, where she was charged with first-degree murder. Her arrest was a relief to Susan's grieving family and a small, shaken community that had lived in fear of what she might do next. By early 2013, the trial of Lyla Carter began, drawing national attention. It was held in the Jefferson County Courthouse, and the proceedings were marked by a mix of somber reflection and heated emotion. The courtroom was packed every day, with members of the community eager to see justice served. The prosecution's case was strong, led by Assistant District Attorney Carolyn Weaver, a seasoned litigator known for her meticulous approach. Weaver painted Lyla as a dangerous and manipulative woman whose obsession with Mark drove her to murder Susan in a jealous rage. She presented a timeline of events supported by damning evidence, text messages, and voicemails from Lyla to Susan, some of which contained veiled threats. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and DNA, linking Lyla to the crime scene. A series of eyewitness accounts placing Lyla near the Wallace home on the morning of March 6, 2012. Weaver also highlighted Lyla's disturbing journal entries, which revealed a pattern of obsessive and delusional thinking. In these pages, Lyla referred to herself as Mark's one true love and wrote about removing obstacles to their happiness. The defense, led by attorney Paul Grayson, argued that Lyla's actions were the result of mental instability and emotional turmoil. Grayson claimed that her troubled upbringing and the toxic relationship with Mark had pushed her into a state of desperation. He tried to shift blame toward Mark, implying that his manipulation and deceit played a significant role in the events leading up to Susan's death. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Mark Wallace took the stand. His testimony was pivotal, not only for the prosecution's case, but also as a moment of personal reckoning. Mark described his affair with Lyla in excruciating detail, laying bare the extent of his betrayal and his guilt over what had happened to Susan. He spoke about the months leading up to the murder, how he had tried to cut ties with Lyla but had underestimated the depth of her obsession. He portrayed Lyla as manipulative and relentless, recounting how she had harassed Susan and refused to let go of their relationship. Mark's voice cracked as he expressed his remorse, not only for his infidelity, but for the role he believed it played in Susan's death. He stopped short of taking direct responsibility, insisting that he never imagined Lyla would resort to violence. His testimony was a turning point in the trial, swaying the jury further toward conviction. But it also painted Mark as a deeply flawed and tragic figure. A man whose selfish decisions had destroyed the woman he loved and shattered the lives of his children. On March 15, 2013, after 2 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Lyla Carter was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and subdued celebration. Susan's family, who had been present every day of the trial, wept openly as the verdict was read. During the sentencing on March 22, 2013, the judge delivered a scathing condemnation of Lyla's actions, calling the murder the ultimate betrayal of both family and humanity. Lyla was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She remained stoic as the sentence was handed down, though her cold demeanor sent chills through the courtroom. In the aftermath of the trial, the community rallied around Susan's family, remembering her as a devoted mother and kind neighbor whose life had been cut short in the most brutal way. Her parents established the Susan Wallace Memorial Scholarship, aimed at helping women who had experienced betrayal and hardship rebuild their lives. Racked with guilt, Mark sold the family home and moved away with his children. He dedicated his life to raising them, vowing to teach them the importance of honesty and integrity. Though he would never fully forgive himself, he channeled his remorse into creating a better future for his kids. Lyla's life behind bars became one of isolation and illusion. She refused to acknowledge her guilt, clinging to the belief that she and Mark were meant to be together. Her journal, confiscated during her arrest, revealed that even in prison, she fantasized about their reunion. This is a very sad and scary story of how unchecked and hidden atrocities can lead to the demise of a loved one. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and also check out another of A cases, the case where a grandmother's affair with 2 younger men ends in double homicide. See you in the next video.